Well, welcome everyone. My name is Jason Leaf. I teach at Northwestern College, and I also am an editor for the Reformed Journal. And I am here with Justin Bailey. Justin, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, greetings everyone. I'm Justin Bailey and I teach theology at Dordt University here in Sioux Center, Iowa.
And how long have you been at Dordt?
I'm going into year 4.
Year 4. And you graduated, you did your work at Fuller, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Nice. And you have a book coming out, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But you've written a piece that hopefully everybody will read, connected with this video. And the piece is called Defense and Discernment, Bearing Witness in Suspicious Times. Very good piece, by the way. I've read it.
Thanks.
And what I'm interested to hear you talk about is this. Say a little bit more about the type of apologetics you're advocating for. I mean, you say in the article that when people think of apologetics, they think of a certain type of arguing, and you're trying to shift apologetics away, not totally away from that, but you have something else in mind. Why don't you explain that?
Yeah, I think that in some ways I'm trying to rehabilitate the word apologetics. Some people would say it's unrehabilitatable. Maybe similar to discussions of the word evangelical or something like that. For a lot of people, apologetics has this sort of picture of two smart people white people on a stage arguing about ideas. Maybe Richard Dawkins, William Lane Craig arguing with each other, two very intelligent, erudite people, sort of this, two geniuses fighting it out over the big ideas. And in recent years, conservative evangelicalism has really latched onto that as a way to sort of shore up defense of the faith, sometimes connected also to concerns about the culture war and things like that. And I'm wanting to say that while illegitimate form of apologetics, is actually a pretty new way of doing apologetics. And I'm wanting to sort of return to a wider tradition, a more holistic tradition. I kind of make the distinction between what I call uppercase apologetics with a capital A and lowercase apologetics with a small a, where uppercase apologetics is this sort of magisterial evidence that demands a verdict sort of apologetics that's really seeking to demonstrate epistemic obligation. You must believe because here are my reasons. And I'm seeking maybe if you can call this a humbler, epistemically humbler apologetics that seeks to respond to the questions that are raised, but to do so in a way that is maybe not quite as defensive and seeks to obtain epistemic permission rather than epistemic obligation. And then the other thing with that, what's maybe unique about my project is the desire to really take the imagination seriously rather than just trotting out my reasons for why you should believe like I believe.
Yeah. Well, and the other word that I saw you use over and over again is the sense of presence. And so I'm interested to know what you mean by presence. And then I would maybe want to follow up because I was also then going to ask about imagination because I know that is really the focus of your work.
Yeah.
What do you mean by presence? And then what do you mean by imagination?
Those are easy questions. Presence, this idea of focus on presence is something that I've not really developed very much in my book. It's sort of a new idea I'm playing with. A lot of times you'll hear critiques of apologetics be oriented towards something like, God doesn't need to be defended. Idols need to be defended. God's the one who defends us. That sort of thing. And I've been sort of thinking about, what that means. And so if we're going to use the metaphor of defense, what is the picture that's in our mind of, are we like these defense attorneys, or are we giving the defense of a testimony? And so I was sort of thinking, what really is it that we're trying to offer? And what is the project of apologetics really about? And I think that I'm wanting to say that it's much more about discerning presence, the presence of God. So under the belief that God is present and active and at work in every cultural situation, apologetics is oriented to discerning what is God doing here, or in this person's life, and this person's doubts, and this person's questions. What is God doing? So that's the first side of it, is sort of discerning divine presence. And then that divine presence is going to manifest itself as well in the presence of the person who is bearing witness, through not just their ideas, but through their person. And the trustworthiness of the claims that you make about Christian faith will always be embedded in the life of the person, who's sharing it. And that's what I was trying to say in the piece, is that when we talk about, we live in suspicious times, and we trust different news sources, and yet perceptions can be changed through the patient testimony of somebody who continues to bear witness, which is what our Black brothers and sisters have been doing for so long. And trying to connect that to, there was a time early in the church, and I think I make this connection in my article. Actually, a student made it for me in class. She said, "This is like the Black Lives Matter movement. This is what Martyr was saying, and the patient presence of Christians in hostile situations offered a trustworthiness to their message, kind of validated the trustworthiness of their message, because they weren't going away. They were there. They were showing up patiently and suffering and defiantly asserting their presence, but also the presence of God in their midst. So that's what I'm trying to say, is that itself is a sort of provocation. Sort of like my wife works for a company based in Los Angeles, and she works remote, but has lots of relationships with people who are not Christian. And one of her friends at work always says, the whole Christian thing just doesn't make sense to me about you, because she doesn't fit his picture of what a Christian is, at least as is kind of portrayed, that this is what Christians do. And so her presence is this imaginative provocation of her testimony. Do you understand what I'm saying? Of her testimony. And then also through that, hopefully, the presence of God.
I really appreciated that the story that you told of that African-American student in the class who read Justin Martyr differently. Yeah. And I think it speaks also to how we, people from different cultures will respond differently and read people like Justin Martyr or the Bible or whatever. It's interesting to see those different kind of perspectives that they take on that. So let me push it a little further then. What do you think this then looks like, this apologetics, this presence? What does it look like during COVID? And what does it look like during Black Lives Matter, during this time now of protest?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I was trying to say in the article, is, again, this is a little bit different than what I'm doing in the book, but is sort of arguing for the long game, as far as, we probably all have different relationships where, whether it's online, on social media, people are starting to feel a little bit more courage to maybe post something that some of their friends or family might be like, oh, wow, are you, a cultural Marxist, or, something like that. And again, I think rather than kind of getting caught up in those reactions, having that sense of patience and willing to say, well, I'm not trying to convince anybody in any kind of, in a link that I'm posting or something like that. But over the course of time, as I demonstrate that this is embedded in my life, this, whatever perspective it is that you have, whether it is that racial justice is a necessity, or whatever it is, or that you should wear masks or something like that. I think I'm just trying to argue that perhaps we can learn from early apologists, from winsome apologists, both in terms of the way that we bear witness in general, as well as the way that we kind of take stands and defend various positions in a really kind of polarized world. To be willing to hear the questions against the perspectives we have, and be called into question ourselves, and I think that that too, as soon as I shift from a posture where I feel like I am the one who must be the spokesperson or the defender of this position, to one in which I see that, this world belongs to God and God is present and active, that sort of takes the pressure off me, in a sense, to have to change people's minds and to have to win, the culture war in my little corner. It sort of allows me to embrace a whole different paradigm of engaging my neighbor, of engaging people who disagree. Again, like it's a sort of, like Makoto Fujimura talks about culture care rather than culture war. And I think it's the apologetics of culture care rather than the apologetics of
Sure.
culture war. And I think it's the discourse of culture care rather than the discourse of culture
Sure.
war. I think that's maybe the parallel that I would draw.
Yeah, no, that's good. So let me push back just a little bit,
Great.
and I'm going to push back, and this comes from a piece that I read and I had my students read. I'm a huge Dietrich Bonhoeffer fan, and I was reading this piece that was written by a woman who's a Bonhoeffer scholar who, prefaces the article by saying, I love Bonhoeffer. I've read everything about Bonhoeffer. But basically went on to say that Bonhoeffer speaks out of privilege, that to talk about vulnerability, to talk about patience, to talk about all of these things assumes a kind of solid, concrete self. And she was writing from a feminist perspective of women, for example, who have never had a voice and who don't have a sense of self. And you could say maybe the same as you think about issues of immigration and Black Lives Matter. How do you respond to that idea that this approach could be seen as an approach of privilege, that it is those who have the privilege to be patient, to wait, to be present, those types of things, to open oneself up to vulnerability? That's not the experience of people who have endured suffering and who've never had a voice. Does that question make sense?
It does make sense, and I feel the force of it. And I think that in one sense, I think that it's a completely legitimate pushback, in the sense that I think that perspective needs to be heard, and I need to admit the fact that it is in many ways, like a lot of theological proposals or ethical proposals, one of privilege. I do want to say, though, at the same time, and maybe the way that I would try to respond to that would be to say that in the long run, again, in the long game, the only way that we have the resources that we have the resources for the struggle for justice, or for the struggle for truth, or for beauty, or for culture care, is through disciplines that require patience, right? Mm-hmm. So through spiritual disciplines of contemplation, especially. So I'm thinking of Sarah Coakley right now, her work, God, Sexuality, and the Self, and how it's in those moments of contemplation, of opening ourselves up to the Lord and being quiet and actually getting away from the fight, getting away from the demands of justice, in order to receive what we need in order to sustain that struggle, over the long term. And I think, I'm reading Dr. King's early sermon, Strength to Love, right now, one every morning. And there was a line that he had there as well about the necessity in that struggle that he has found. So again, I would just want to say I'm trying to learn from those who are not in that position, and to say, let's learn from them. So if you think about the church and all the ways that apologetics, at least for the first 400 years, function on the underside of history rather than the upper side. And that's really what I'm trying to say, is that maybe we can learn from them, which is why we can also learn from people who are making contributions from places that are not in positions of privilege.
Yeah.
And I think out of the resources of that are demanded by all Christians, regardless of whether we are in a place where we have lots of social capital or not, what is required for us is to engage in disciplines of contemplation, disciplines that are patient, that require us to listen more than to speak to the Lord, right? And that kind of functions as that sort of receptivity, imaginative receptivity, functions as the fuel for any work that we're going to do in the world. I don't know if that's
Yeah,
very much
no.
like off the top of my head.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I've always thought too about spiritual formation and the practices of spiritual formation as even sometimes as an attempt to step outside the given rules for the cultural arguments that maybe in a sense spiritual formation allows us. I think of St. Francis of Assisi, who seemed
Yeah.
to just who stepped outside and began to reimagine a different way of life, which in
Yeah.
and of itself is subversive
Yeah.
to the status quo. Well,
Yeah.
let's hear about your book. Give a plug. Tell us about the book. When's it coming out?
Yeah, it's coming out in October. It's called Reimagining Apologetics, and sort of the elevator pitch is crises of faith and doubt are experienced not primarily in the intellect, or at least not alone in the intellect, but in the imagination. We feel sort of maybe, for example, the narrowness of faith before we reject it, right? So there's this felt sense, it doesn't sit well with us before we begin to sort of do the rationalization that this is right or this is not right. And so what would it look like to do apologetics in a way that just takes the imagination more seriously? And I don't want to, again, I don't want to do away with rational argument or anything like that. I just sort of want to say these things really work together. And then specifically, I'm working off of, like a lot of people these days, I guess, Charles Taylor's understanding the secularity and secularity as a sort of imaginative crisis.
Yep.
Both the crisis of the imagination, but also for the imagination, because the imagination is now being tasked to make all of these connections that in an enchanted world just kind of were more natural.
Yeah.
And so specifically, I write about authenticity, which is sort of this internal call to compose a life that is original. So sort of find your own way of being human. And whereas a lot of people want to say, like, that's just narcissism, that's just expressivism run amok, I want to say, well, let's actually dig into this conversation that our culture is having about this and see if we can move towards a thicker version of authenticity, which again requires, because it's a work of composition, imaginative attunement.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of what I'm arguing in the early part of the book. And then the latter part of the book, I give examples of a reimagined apologetic from two different thinkers who are coming out of broadly reformed traditions. And I make that connection because I feel like they have a similar view of God's active presence in the world, which is fundamentally a Calvinist apprehension of the world. And they're George MacDonald from the 19th century, and then Marilyn Robinson, who is a contemporary Pulitzer Prize-winning author. And then those are my sort of two case studies in reimagining apologetics. And then I sort of say, what could this look like on the popular level? But it's mostly a work of maybe methodology,
Sure.
rather than a how-to book. If they say this, you say that. It's not that at all. It's much more a reflection on the discipline of apologetics itself.
Yeah. And when does that come out?
It comes out October 13th, I believe.
October 13th, and published with who?
InterVarsity Press Academic.
Nice.
Yeah.
Great. And we'll, I'm sure, be able to get it on Amazon. And
Yep, it's on there now.
Oh, it's on there right now.
It's on there right now. Yeah.
Well, great. Well, Justin, well, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation. Thanks for your piece. And again, I hope people will go and read it. It's very well done, very thoughtful. And I really look forward to your book.
Thanks, Jason. Appreciate it. Good talking to you.